Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, Shake Milton's role with the Timberwolves, why he's essentially replacing Jaylen Nowell's role, but why he's a better fit. We'll talk about the Wolves rotation, what I would anticipate Shake's role to be this year. Plus, Bruce Brown had some positive comments about the Timberwolves and how difficult it was to play against them in the playoffs. I'll break that down a little bit, explain why he's right. Then also, what if the Timberwolves were in the Eastern Conference? Wolves fans have dreamed about this forever. But how could it realistically happen with NBA expansion? It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Thursday, everybody, and a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. Also, along with all the other Minnesota Locked On podcasts, you can find this show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, which you can get on either Roku or Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And of course, you can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at my account, which is at Beecken with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right. Today on the show, a few things to get to. I want to start with Shake Milton, and we're going to kind of break down the free agent signings here over the next couple of days. We'll spend some more time on Troy Brown Jr. on Friday. But I want to talk a little bit about Shake today. We'll start there and what I think his role will be. And then we'll get on to a couple of other topics, including Bruce Brown's positive comments about the Timberwolves. And then I'm fascinated by the idea of I like geography, and I'm also fascinated by the idea of sports expanding, what markets they could go to, what that could all look like. Timberwolves fans have been dreaming for years and frankly decades about being in the Eastern Conference and how positive that would be for the Timberwolves playoff prospects, especially in the dark days of whatever 16 straight years with no playoff appearances. We'll talk about that later in the show. Let's start with Shake Milton. After the Wolves signed him, I guess almost 3 weeks ago now, I talked quite a bit about why I like the fit with Minnesota, mostly because he can both play off the ball and also play make, which is oversimplifying it. But I thought he was a better version of Jaylen Nowell. I want to talk a little bit more about how similar they are and basically why Shake Milton is essentially like a grown-up version. Sounds not kind to Jaylen Nowell, but like I think a more professional, polished, maybe polished is a better way to say it. Shake Milton's a more polished version of Jaylen Nowell in a lot of ways, but there's some things that he's much better at too. First of all, that's essentially the role he's going to play, right? It's going to be the nominal sixth man. In reality, Kyle Anderson's the sixth man. He's going to play the most minutes of anyone off the bench. He's also going to be the first one to be added to the starting lineup. Very likely, like say Jaden McDaniels misses a game. I guess Nickeil Alexander-Walker could get that start, but it could be Kyle Anderson at the 3. We'll see Kyle Anderson play the 4 if, just like last year when Cat was out for an extended period of time, when Nas missed games, when Rudy, if Rudy's out, Nas plays the 5, Anderson becomes the backup 4 if Nas has played more minutes at the 5. Like that's Kyle Anderson is going to get those minutes. And then Nas Reed's kind of the next guy, right? Like the salary tells you that. And they're going to find a way to get him on the floor. But in terms of the backcourt, the primary backcourt backup is going to have to be Shake Milton. He could play for most of his career by position title, he's played shooting guard, but he's initiated a lot of offense off the bench for the last several years for the Philadelphia 76ers. He's been there for 5 seasons, or he was in Philly for 5 seasons, and his role shifted a little bit. Early on, of course, he wasn't a rotation guy. He was more of like a sixth-man scorer type than the next couple of years. Really kind of his second season in the league was his best shooting season, and he started roughly half the games that year. That was the COVID-shortened season. And then the next year, he was almost strictly a bench guy, but he saw his scoring at his highest rate, his minutes per game at its highest rate. In the last couple of years, his role has been reduced just a little, but he's still played 20 or more minutes per game in each of the last 4 seasons. That's actually more minutes per game than Jaylen Nowell played this year. And it felt like Jaylen Nowell was on the court an awful lot for this team. When he was healthy, you remember he had the knee issue late in the season, but Nowell averaged around 19 minutes per game. Shake was almost 21 minutes per game for his career, right around 21 minutes per game. So I think he's going to see a similar minutes share as Jaylen Nowell did. And similar to Jaylen Nowell, by position title will be a shooting guard, but will also initiate a lot of offense for the Wolves second unit. So consider some of the rate-based stats and how similar they are. Jaylen Nowell for his career has a 16.5% assist rate. Shake Milton for his career, 19.5% assist rate. So 3 points higher, which is fairly significant. Now the turnover rate's also higher, 12.1%. Jaylen Nowell's was set, or for his career, 7.9%. It was at his career highest or career worst this last year, which was roughly 9%. Shake Milton's was also a career worst, 14.5%. Each player initiated more offense for their respective teams than they had in previous seasons. So that's part of that. But with the increase in passing, because, increase in assist rate, of course, there's going to be a little bit, there's going to be a bit of a push and pull, a give and take, if you will. You're going to see that rise in turnover rate. Usage rate wise, of course, Jaylen Nowell had a career high 25% usage rate this last year. Shake was only 18.5%. For their careers, though, Jaylen Nowell is 22.5%. Shake Milton is 20.1%. A lot of similarities there. What I do like about Shake Milton, if we're comparing these two directly, is the free throw rate is much better, a .226 for his career. Jaylen Nowell's .184. We saw that dip precipitously this last year. It was very, very good 2 years ago when Nowell was a very positive impact off the Wolves bench in the 21-22 season. But the free throw rate declined dramatically last year. And if you want to talk about it in terms of free throw attempts per game, it looked the same, but it was simply because he was shooting the ball. It had to do with essentially the shot selection that Nowell had and the number of opportunities he had. He saw the usage rate go way up, but the free throw attempts per game stayed the same. That means the free throw rate went down. Shake Milton had a very healthy free throw rate last season for the Sixers, and he has for his career had a healthy free throw rate and is, of course, a really good free throw shooter, 83% at the line. Nowell's also a good free throw shooter, but again, he didn't get there enough this last year. The shot distribution, though, very similar. Shake just shot a little bit more at the rim. He was a little better at drawing fouls. And ultimately that really matters. Otherwise, though, the shot profiles are very, very similar. Last season, Jaylen Nowell, according to Basketball Reference, attempted 22% of his field goal attempts came from within 3 feet of the basket. Exact same for Shake Milton. Jaylen Nowell was 22.8%, Jaylen Nowell was 22.1%. Shake Milton was 22.8%. Jaylen Nowell, 20.7%. We'll call it 21% of his shot attempts came from between 3 and 10 feet. Shake Milton, 22%. Between 10 feet and 16 feet. Shake Milton, 14% of his shots from there. Jaylen Nowell, 13% of his shots from there. 16 feet to the three-point line. 4% of Jaylen Nowell's shots, 7% of Shake Milton's shots. So Shake actually shot a little bit more from the mid-range. Jaylen Nowell shot a lot more from three. Almost 40% of his shot attempts were three-pointers, whereas Shake Milton was about 1 in every 3. The difference is that Shake Milton shot the ball much better, 38% from 3, rounding up slightly. Jaylen Nowell was a miserable 29% from 3. So shot profiles similar. Shake Milton attempts more free throws, less threes, but he makes the threes at a much higher clip. He's also got a much higher assist rate, 3 points higher assist rate. And both players initiated a lot of offense as essentially secondary playmakers with the second unit last year. That's the role Shake Milton's going to fit into for the Wolves, is a more polished version of what Jaylen Nowell is. And we'll take this a little bit further here in a moment. I want to look at some of Jaylen Nowell's best lineups with the Wolves last year and why I think Shake Milton will be a better fit in those lineups for the Wolves moving forward in 23-24. So we'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think will hit the first home run. It's all in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. You can also bet plenty of other sports on MLB, or excuse me, on FanDuel. We're almost to football season. We're just a few weeks away, like less than a month away from preseason NFL football. That'll be on FanDuel. Regular season NFL football just a few weeks after that. College football starts in August too. There's no better place to bet on any of these sports, including MLB, ongoing right now in the middle of the summer, than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Every day or tomorrow, we're actually going to have one of the Kamenetsky brothers, I think Andy Kamenetsky, excuse me. One of the Kamenetsky brothers will join the show. We're going to talk a little bit about Troy Brown Jr., get the perspective from them on what he brought to the Lakers last couple of seasons. I'm also going to go on Locked On Lakers. I think it'll be Friday's show talking about Taurean Prince. So I'll do a segment on their show. We'll do at least a segment, maybe two on Troy Brown Jr. for this show. So that'll be a big focus of Friday's program. Make sure you tune back in. And then all of next week, we'll keep breaking down the roster as we're still daily every single day of the week, Monday through Friday next week as well. All right. Let's continue the Shake Milton conversation. Kind of a related note here. I mentioned that I think he's essentially in the Nowell role. I think Troy Brown Jr. basically gets the Taurean Prince role. The minutes breakdown isn't going to be identical, of course, but that's kind of what I see happening is he takes the Taurean Prince role as kind of the bigger wing, while Shake Milton is the Jaylen Nowell role as the backup combo guard. And Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who's the other addition/re-addition, he's himself / I guess Austin Rivers. And if you're wondering like how this whole minutes thing breaks down, well, remember the starting lineup, take 5 guys, right? Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Jay McDaniels, Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert. That's 5. Kyle Anderson, Naz Reid are the other 2 guys in that top 7. Your next 3 in some order are Milton, Brown, and Alexander Walker. Those are your next 3, no questions asked. I think McLaughlin and Minette are kind of that next layer. And then there's another layer before you get to Wendell Moore Jr. and Leonard Miller potentially. But that's your top 10. So your 8, 9, and 10 guys are, in some order, Milton, Brown, Alexander Walker. Alexander Walker, I think, is going to get the least minutes of that role. Recency bias, like we all have fresh in our minds that like, oh man, he played this huge role in slowing down SGA and Jamal Murray, and he had this big role in the playoffs. That's true. But remember before the Jaden McDaniels injury, those minutes really fluctuated for Alexander Walker. He early on joined the rotation when Jaylen Nowell was injured. So remember, there was no Jaylen Nowell. So he was in the Jaylen Nowell role. And was getting around 15 to 20 minutes per game. Then Nowell came back. We also had Taurean Prince had some illness stuff, and then he was back. There were 4 straight games from March 27th to April 2nd where Nickeil Alexander-Walker played less than 10 minutes. He played 9 minutes, 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes in those games. Then he played 14, 16. McDaniels breaks his hand, and then in the playoffs, all of a sudden, Nickeil Alexander-Walker is playing 25-plus minutes per game. He played 38 minutes in the Game 4 win over the Nuggets, 38 minutes in the season-ending loss to the Nuggets in Game 5. So those heavy playoff minutes were not the norm. That's because there was no McDaniels and basically no Nowell at that point, right? Now, I'm assuming Shake Milton's going to have a much bigger role in the offense off the bench than what Alexander Walker would. I know Alexander Walker can run some offense. I know that's one of the options. It probably is going to depend a little bit on matchups because he's certainly a superior defender to Shake Milton. But I think Milton will more regularly get more minutes than Alexander Walker. And matchups are going to matter a ton here. Certainly. There's no question about that. But I think Alexander Walker is kind of in that 9th, 10th man role where some nights you're going to see heavy minutes. Some nights he's going to get a spot start for whatever reason, injury, illness, back-to-back rest, whatever. But kind of that in and out of the rotation role. I think that's probably him, unless he's shown some real improvement in terms of shooting the basketball, et cetera. And then maybe he eats into some of the Milton or Brown minutes. But I think Alexander Walker kind of becomes that swing guy that can play heavier minutes one night, maybe only play 5, 6, 7 minutes another night. But it's going to depend a lot on opponent and matchup. A few lineup thoughts related to Shake Milton. I went in, I pulled from Cleaning the Glass some of the best, or actually all of the Jaylen Nowell lineups from last year to kind of try and figure out what were some of the best combinations. In Jaylen Nowell's most used combination last year, most used five-man combination was with Nowell at the point guard spot and Anthony Edwards at the 2, and otherwise was basically the starting lineup the Wolves used for a lot of the year, which is McDaniels at the 3, Anderson at the 4, and Gobert at the 5. So that's effectively when Nowell was playing sixth man for this team. And they were a plus 17.7 in those minutes with Nowell at the 1 and Edwards at the 2. Or I should say the point differential. It's not net rating. Point differential is plus 17.7. And it was one of Nowell's better lineups. There's kind of a common theme here. His best overall lineup that had more than 50 possessions was him at the 1, Austin Rivers at the 2, and Anthony Edwards playing the 3 with McDaniels and Naz Reid. And what this tells me is it's as much about Anthony Edwards as it is about Jaylen Nowell. It's Ant having the ability to kind of de facto run the offense, but also play off of another dynamic. Dynamic, is that the right word? Of a guy who's comfortable being a primary or secondary playmaker. And of course, the counterpoint here would be, well, what about D'Angelo Russell? But D'Angelo Russell was never really comfortable being a secondary scorer. He was fine being a primary scorer and secondary playmaker. But he was never comfortable deferring first, right? And that, I think, and neither was Jaylen Nowell really either, but there were moments where like he was running pick and roll and he was driving and kicking to Anthony Edwards. Not a lot because Nowell didn't do the kick portion as much. But to have two dynamic ball handlers in the backcourt and somebody who can understand how to cut off ball like a Shake Milton, that's going to make a lot of sense this season. And clearly the Wolves looked at Shake Milton and said, this is a more polished version of Jaylen Nowell. He's a better shooter. He's a moderately better defender. Jaylen Nowell was actually the second. I think I said this not too long ago on the show. Nowell actually had the second worst defensive real plus minus of any shooting guard in the entire league. He was 95th out of 96 in ESPN's real plus minus defensively. Now, Shake Milton was 82nd, but also his defensive real plus minus was almost twice as good. That's how bad Jaylen Nowell's was. Like, Shake Milton wasn't good defensively either, but I think he's moderately better than Jaylen Nowell. And I do think he's a better cutter off the ball. I think he's a more of a solid playmaker with the ball in his hands and will play well with Anthony Edwards. And again, looking at some of that lineup data from last year, it's pretty clear. And also, by the way, Anthony Edwards' best lineups that didn't include what you would call the rest of the quote unquote big four from the start of the year, Cat, Rudy, and D'Lo. So Anthony Edwards lineups without Cat, Rudy, and D'Lo, his best lineups came with Jaylen Nowell. Like, he was actually better with Jaylen Nowell on the floor, almost twice as good point differential wise with Jaylen Nowell on the floor as he was with Mike Conley. Anthony Edwards was. Now, it's a smaller sample. Well, actually, no, it's actually pretty similar because Mike Conley was on the team for only the latter part of the season. But there were a lot of possessions earlier in the year with Anthony Edwards and Jaylen Nowell. Also, Anthony Edwards' differential with Jordan McLaughlin on the floor was pretty good too. We saw stretches this year where the second unit with Anthony Edwards kind of plugged into that nominal, the 2-guard role, but really he's running the offense with somebody that was comfortable off the ball, like a Nowell or a McLaughlin. Those were really beneficial units for the Wolves. It didn't work great with McLaughlin in long stretches because he's so undersized, but we saw it work well with Jaylen Nowell at times. And then when Jaylen Nowell took over the offense or when Nowell was on the floor without Anthony Edwards, that was an abject disaster. And now I think the Wolves could steal some of those minutes with Ant on the bench. You put Shake Milton in the game and you try and leave one of Karl-Anthony Towns or Rudy Gobert in with Shake Milton, but you can kind of stagger those. And then I think you're in a much better place with Milton on the floor and no Anthony Edwards than you ever were with Jaylen Nowell on the floor and no Anthony Edwards. It gives the Wolves somebody else who can create for themselves and others. And you just feel good doing that. You have some lower usage type guys that can catch and shoot, run in transition like Troy Brown Jr., Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and you can make that work. And then, of course, Naz Reid is going to be a scorer off the bench for you too. So all that to say, a lot of similarities between Jaylen Nowell and Shake Milton. But again, the way that I will keep describing this is a more polished version of Nowell, somebody who's been on really good playoff teams, played with other star players, whether it be James Harden or Joel Embiid or going way back, Ben Simmons or other stars among the many that have been through Philadelphia in the last few years. Shake Milton understands how to fit a role, and I'm not sure I'm pretty confident we never got there with Jaylen Nowell, and I think that's going to be important this year as the Wolves kind of, in my opinion, have much better depth. Okay, I want to talk about Bruce Brown's comments about the Wolves here in just a minute, and then also briefly a little bit of relocation talks. We're going to do that here next. All right, correcting something I just said. I said relocation talk. Not at all what I meant. I meant to say expansion talk. And could the Wolves move to the Eastern Conference? What could that look like? We'll get to that here in a second. First, the Bruce Brown conversation. Bruce Brown was on a podcast this last week. And I'm going to get the name of the podcast here so I don't, so I make sure I give some credit here. It was the Run Your Race podcast. He was asked about how tough the run to the NBA championship was. Of course, Bruce Brown, key bench piece for the Nuggets this last year. He said their toughest series was Minnesota. Then he was asked why, and he said, quote, "They had good players, Mike Conley, Cat, Ant. I think that was our toughest series." And then he went on to talk about, he actually expanded a little bit more on how Anthony Edwards was one of the toughest covers in the league. I think he said Shea Gilgeous-Alexander and Anthony Edwards were his two toughest covers because Ant was doing everything at all three levels, which is 100% true. That's why Anthony Edwards is considered by many to be one of the best young stars in the league because he can score at every level. But the comment about the playoffs is true. Like we said this, many people said this at the time. If you looked at some of the competition Denver faced, and everyone was excited about Phoenix and Kevin Durant, and rightfully so. But remember, they beat Phoenix by 20 plus in the first game. They held them to 87 in the second game. Yes, Phoenix won games 3 and 4, but the last couple games weren't close either. So really all four of Denver's wins over Phoenix were blowouts. In the Minnesota series, only game 1 was a blowout. Remember, game 2, the Wolves had a late lead. Game 3, the Wolves had a late lead. Game 4, the Wolves led late, and it went to overtime. The Wolves won. And game 5 was close throughout. So that series, I mean, game 1 was the only game that wasn't close in the Denver-Minnesota series. The Phoenix series, all 4 wins by Denver were blowouts. The Lakers series was a sweep, and I think really 2 of the 4 were complete blowouts, but there were at least 3 that weren't all that close. And then the finals, kind of the same story, right? They only lost 1 game in the finals. So high praise for Bruce Brown. Makes like it's not all that surprising, but it's interesting to hear somebody from the actual team that won the championship admit that. And of course, it doesn't mean anything ultimately, but it's a little bit validating, I think it's fair to say. All right, I want to close with, I was thinking about this. Actually, I saw a article over at Zone Coverage by Charlie Walton, just kind of a random article seemingly about if the NBA expands, or I should say when the NBA expands, could the Wolves be pushed to the Eastern Conference? This isn't anything new or breaking by any stretch, but I started thinking about it a little bit, and I hadn't really put pen to paper, if you will, not literally, but as a figure of speech in a while. It would be pretty easy, and I feel like the NBA's most logical path to this, if they expand, and certainly Seattle's going to be one of the teams or one of the markets. I would think Las Vegas is probably the other. I know they're on the verge of getting a baseball team. They got hockey a few years ago. But Vegas is another logical addition. If you add Seattle to the Northwest Division, where the Wolves currently are, and you add Vegas to the Pacific Division and kick Minnesota to the Eastern Conference into the Central Division, now you have 16 teams in each conference. You'd have 2 divisions that have 6 teams, the Pacific Division in the West and the Central Division in the East. It would be just like baseball was several years ago when there was, I think it was the National League Central had an extra team in it. At one point, there were 2 divisions with an extra team. So you could do that. And in the NBA, divisions really only matter in terms of scheduling more than anything else. So I don't know that there's any competitive advantage or disadvantage to doing that. It would make the schedule a little bit unbalanced. But the only other option really would be if you went with 2 8-team divisions in each conference, and still the easiest path would be to kick Minnesota to the East. The only other conceivable option would be to kick Memphis to the East. They're technically further east than Minnesota. Put them in the Southeast Division instead of the Southwest. And then you could bump the Thunder to the Southwest and add Seattle to the Northwest. So Minnesota stays in the Northwest Division. I think that makes less sense without running all of the actual miles, which would take forever, I'm pretty confident that keeping Minnesota in the Central Division saves mileage, would be less overall travel miles than Memphis in the Southeast, because Minnesota is much closer to Milwaukee, Chicago than, say, Memphis even is to Charlotte or Atlanta. So those are really the two possibilities, because either way, assuming it's Seattle and Vegas, it's either Memphis going to the East or it's Minnesota going to the East. That's kind of it. And in my opinion, I think you just go with the two six team divisions in either conference, and then 2 5-team divisions remain. But again, even if you go with 2 8-team divisions, the way it works in the NHL is the top 3 teams in each division make the playoffs, and there's 2 wild cards. So you could do that, or you could still go, the division only matters in terms of scheduling. So you play all 8 teams in your division more often than you play the 8 teams in the other division of your conference. Fine. But you could still go top 8 teams in the conference make the playoffs, just like the NBA does now. So there's a few different ways that could go with this. Who knows how the midseason tournament could play in at some point in the future. There's, of course, still the play-in. It's kind of fun that there's this many different wrinkles, and I'm sure that Adam Silver and the NBA have kind of gamed this out over the next several years, if and when the NBA actually does expand. But it's a fascinating thing to consider. And I mean, it would be much better from a competition standpoint for the Timberwolves selfishly. Of course, the East was, had having Milwaukee be dominant throughout the season, but as evidenced by Denver winning the title, the West was really difficult, even if at times it looked like there were a lot of middling teams. But for Denver to say that Minnesota was the toughest series is another way to kind of underscore just how good the Western Conference was this season. But Minnesota being in the same division as Milwaukee, Chicago, the Pacers, the Pistons, and the Cavs would really cut down on travel. It would also mean, now both Minnesota and Memphis are in the Central Time Zone, right? So it would also mean that Minnesota would have a lot more games starting at 6 p.m. Central, which depending on your work schedule may be a good or a bad thing, but it would mean less late nights for sure, because there'd be less games in the Western Time Zone. Still some, obviously, but less, and more games in the Eastern Time Zone. So there's that to think about too. But I don't know. At this point, like I would think the earliest it could happen is 3 to 4 years from now. I mean, these things take time. The arena is underway in Seattle, of course, so it's feasible. COVID also undoubtedly slowed this whole thing down, but something to think about. It's one of those things when you sit around and think about the NBA in July and August. You spend a little more time kind of breaking that down, and it's fun to think about. So anyway, all right. As promised on Friday, we're going to spend a bunch of time talking about Troy Brown Jr., breaking down his game, getting some knowledge from Locked On Lakers and their thoughts on what he brought to LA last year. Of course, was at times a really key rotation player for a team that ended up in the conference finals. So we'll learn a bit more about him on Friday's show. That'll be our primary focus as we get you to the weekend. So that's all we have for today. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen each and every day. It's greatly appreciated. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube. If you do watch on YouTube, please subscribe, please comment, like the video. It definitely helps us out. It's greatly appreciated. You can listen wherever you listen to podcasts, and wherever you listen, please subscribe, review, all that good stuff as well. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku or Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves, and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. The Locked On Podcast Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.